There is a drawer in the Ministry of Magic's Department of Mysteries that nobody opens willingly, a catalog of spells so terrible that even whispering their names makes the torches flicker. And tonight, with the fire burning low and the world gone quiet outside your window, you are going to open that drawer together with me. You settle deeper into wherever you are resting right now, perhaps beneath heavy blankets or curled into a familiar chair, and you let your breathing slow as we begin this journey into the darkest corners of the wizarding world that J.K. Rowling constructed across 7 novels, 8 films, and countless supplementary materials that continue to expand our understanding of magical malevolence. The concept of dark magic in the Harry Potter universe operates on principles that would have felt remarkably familiar to medieval Europeans, who genuinely believed that certain spoken formulas could invoke demonic forces. In fact, the word abracadabra, which many scholars trace to Aramaic phrases meaning "I create as I speak," appeared in the writings of the Roman physician Serenus Simonicus around 200 AD as a genuine medical remedy meant to cure malaria when worn as an amulet, which is either the earliest example of magical healthcare or the worst medical advice in recorded history, depending on your perspective. You notice as we proceed that dark magic in this fictional world is not simply magic that causes harm, because even a simple stunning spell can injure someone, but rather magic that requires malicious intent as its fundamental power source. Magic that corrupts the caster as much as it damages the target. And this distinction remains what scholars of children's literature call an open area of interpretive debate regarding whether Rowling intended to create a moral universe where intent matters more than outcome, or one where certain actions are inherently irredeemable regardless of motivation. The Ministry of Magic, that bumbling bureaucratic institution that somehow manages to regulate an entire hidden society while consistently missing obvious dark wizards hiding in plain sight. One might say their detection methods need work, rather like a smoke alarm that only goes off after the house has already burned down. Classified 18 distinct spells as officially dark by the conclusion of the Second Wizarding War, though the criteria for this classification evolved considerably over the centuries. There exists a quirky historical footnote that Rowling herself mentioned in interviews. The original draft of the first novel included a spell called Perditio that was meant to cause objects to decay into dust, but she removed it because she felt it too closely resembled real alchemical terminology from the 16th century manuscripts, and she worried actual historians might write angry letters, which suggests she understood her audience better than most authors do. You find yourself now considering the architectural foundation upon which all wizarding understanding of dark magic rests, the 3 unforgivable curses, which earned their name not through casual ministry brainstorming sessions, but through centuries of accumulated horror that taught magical society exactly what happens when certain powers remain unchecked. The British Ministry of Magic officially classified the Killing Curse, the Cruciatus Curse, and the Imperious Curse as unforgivable in 1717, the same year that the Grand Lodge of England established Freemasonry in London, meaning that while Muggles were busy inventing secret handshakes and mysterious rituals, wizards were codifying which magical acts would result in lifetime imprisonment in a fortress guarded by soul-sucking wraiths. Honestly, the wizarding world has always had a flair for dramatic punishment, as if simple incarceration felt too mundane for beings who could turn teacups into tortoises. You understand intuitively that these 3 curses share a common requirement that distinguishes them from ordinary harmful magic. They demand that the caster genuinely mean the harm they intend to inflict, wanting it with their whole being, which means that accidentally saying Avada Kedavra while sneezing will not actually kill anyone. A relief for allergy sufferers throughout the magical community, one imagines. The historical record, as documented in Fantastic Beasts supplementary materials and Pottermore writings, suggests that these curses existed long before their official prohibition, with some magical historians arguing that variations of the Killing Curse appear in ancient Egyptian magical texts, though this interpretation remains contested among scholars who study the intersection of real-world historical magic and Rowling's fictional extrapolations. There is a peculiar tidbit buried in production notes from the films. The visual effects team originally designed the Cruciatus curse to appear as red lightning, but director Alfonso Cuarón insisted on invisible effects to emphasize that the most terrible pain cannot be seen, only felt, which accidentally aligned with Victorian spiritualist beliefs that the most potent supernatural forces operate beyond human perception. You breathe slowly now, recognizing that understanding these curses requires us to examine each one individually, to trace their origins and mechanisms, and the terrible purposes they serve. And so we shall proceed into darker territory still, though always with the gentle reminder that this is merely story, merely fiction, wrapped in the comforting blanket of imagination. You stand now at the threshold of examining the most infamous spell in the entire Harry Potter canon, the killing curse known as Avada Kedavra, those two words that produce a flash of green light and instantaneous death with no known magical counter except the ancient protection of sacrificial love. And as you settle deeper into relaxation, you recognize that understanding this curse requires tracing its etymology, its mechanics, its place within wizarding jurisprudence, and the philosophical questions it raises about the nature of mortality in a world where magic can accomplish virtually anything except, apparently, reverse death itself. The phrase Avada Kedavra derives from the Aramaic Avra Kedabra, which translates roughly to, "I will create as I speak," though Rowling has acknowledged in interviews that she deliberately played with the phonetic similarity to abracadabra, that stage magician's standby that has entertained children at birthday parties for centuries. There is something deeply unsettling about realizing that the silly word you associated with rabbits emerging from hats shares linguistic DNA with fictional murder, rather like discovering that your friendly neighborhood ice cream truck plays a tune originally composed for funerals. The mainstream historical fact underpinning this curse's conceptual origins lies in the very real practice of defictiones, or curse tablets, which ancient Greeks and Romans inscribed with harmful wishes against their enemies and deposited in graves, wells, or temples. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of these lead tablets, many requesting that the gods strike down the writer's adversaries, which suggests humanity has always yearned for the power to harm others at a distance without getting our hands dirty. You observe that within the Harry Potter narrative, the killing curse functions according to specific rules that Rowling established gradually across the series. It cannot be blocked by ordinary magical shields. It leaves no mark upon the body of its victim, except in the unique case of Harry Potter, whose lightning bolt scar became the symbol of survival against impossible odds, and it requires such thorough malicious intent that Severus Snape's use of it against Dumbledore in Half-Blood Prince actually represented an act of mercy rather than murder, which scholars of young adult literature continue to debate regarding whether this moral complexity is appropriate for the target audience or simply brilliant narrative construction. The quirky historical tidbit relevant here involves the medieval concept of pointing, a folk belief throughout Europe that certain individuals could kill merely by pointing at their victims while concentrating ill will, and numerous witch trial records from the 15th through 17th centuries include testimonies from accusers claiming that the accused pointed at my cow and it died 3 days hence, suggesting that the human fear of death by directed intention predates Rowling's imagination by several centuries at minimum. You notice the gentle irony that a curse designed to end life instantaneously became the mechanism through which Voldemort accidentally created the very circumstances of his own eventual defeat, as his attempt to murder the infant Harry Potter backfired catastrophically due to Lily Potter's sacrificial protection, and there is almost a cosmic joke embedded in this narrative structure. The Dark Lord so obsessed with conquering death that he could not recognize love's power, rather like a person so focused on their phone that they walk into a lamppost, except the lamppost is the entire moral architecture of the universe, and the phone is megalomania. The curse's green light has become so iconic that fans worldwide recognize it instantly, and production designers for the films specifically chose that particular shade of emerald because test audiences associated it with sickness and poison, drawing upon psychological research showing that humans instinctively recoil from certain color combinations, which means that somewhere in the Warner Brothers archives exists a color testing document that essentially reads, Which green best represents sudden death? The philosophical question that emerges from examining Avada Kedavra involves what scholars call the ethics of fantasy violence, specifically whether depicting instantaneous, painless death in fiction sanitizes mortality, or whether providing young readers with symbolic frameworks for understanding death serves important developmental purposes, and this debate remains genuinely unresolved among literary critics and child psychologists who study the effects of fantasy literature on developing minds. You breathe slowly and recognize that the killing curse, despite its horror, serves a narrative purpose beyond mere shock value. It establishes absolute stakes. It creates a villain whose willingness to use this curse defines his moral bankruptcy, and it provides the backdrop against which acts of courage and love become meaningful. Because courage means nothing without genuine risk, and love means nothing without the possibility of permanent loss. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable truth about dark magic in fiction. It exists so that light magic has something to illuminate. You drift now toward examination of the remaining two unforgivable curses, Crucio and Imperio, which together with Avada Kedavra form the unholy trinity of magical prohibitions that define the boundaries of acceptable magical conduct. And as your breathing continues its slow, steady rhythm, you find yourself contemplating how these curses explore different dimensions of cruelty, where the killing curse offers the mercy of instantaneous ending. The Cruciatus curse inflicts suffering without end, and the Imperious curse steals the victim's very self, and each represents a different nightmare, a different category of violation that the wizarding world deemed too terrible to permit. The Cruciatus curse, invoked with the incantation Crucio, from the Latin word for eye torture, causes such overwhelming physical and psychological pain that extended exposure can result in permanent insanity, as demonstrated most tragically through the fate of Frank and Alice Longbottom, Neville's parents, who were tortured by Bellatrix Lestrange and her companions until their minds shattered beyond repair. And honestly, the detail that they reside permanently in St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries, occasionally giving Neville candy wrappers as their only form of connection, remains one of the most devastating emotional through lines in the entire series, making you wonder whether Rowling specifically designed this subplot to ensure readers would cry at unexpected moments forever. The mainstream historical parallel here involves the very real history of judicial torture in medieval and early modern Europe, where officials believed that physical torment could extract truth from the human body, leading to the development of devices like the rack, thumbscrews, and strappado. The British Parliament did not formally abolish judicial torture until 1640, meaning that the real-world ancestors of Harry Potter's Wizarding Society were actively torturing people, while the fictional wizarding world was already debating whether to classify the Cruciatus curse as unforgivable, which suggests the fictional society was actually more ethically advanced than the real one. A realization that lands differently depending on how you feel about humanity's historical record. The quirky fringe tidbit connected to this curse involves the relatively obscure anthropological concept of sympathetic pain, documented in various cultures where community members reportedly experienced phantom suffering when witnessing torture of their relatives, and some researchers in the 1890s attempted to study this phenomenon scientifically before concluding that the effect was purely psychological, though their methodology would not survive modern peer review, as it mostly involved asking people, "Did that hurt to watch?" and writing down their answers with great seriousness. You recognize that the Imperious curse operates through an entirely different mechanism of violation, stripping victims of their free will and rendering them compliant puppets who will perform any action their controller demands. And this curse carries particular historical resonance because the defense, "I was under the Imperious curse," became notorious after Voldemort's first fall, when numerous Death Eaters claimed they had been controlled rather than willing participants, creating a magical equivalent of the Nuremberg defense that continues to raise questions among scholars about accountability, culpability, and the philosophical foundations of free will itself, an open area of scholarly debate that mirrors real-world discussions about coercion, brainwashing, and the limits of individual responsibility. The sensation of being under the imperious curse, as Harry describes it during Barty Crouch Jr.'s defense against the dark arts class, involves a dreamy, floating feeling of peace and emptiness, where all anxiety disappears, because all choice disappears. And there is something uncomfortably seductive about this description, something that acknowledges why certain people might seek escape from the burden of decision-making. Rather like those moments when you secretly wish someone would just tell you what to eat for dinner every night so you never had to think about it again, except multiplied by infinity and stripped of all autonomy. The Imperious Curse also introduces the concept of magical resistance, as Harry's ability to throw off the curse demonstrates that sufficient strength of character can overcome mental subjugation, which raises interesting questions about whether this resistance is innate talent, trained skill, or moral quality. And the films somewhat simplified this by showing Harry merely straining against invisible bonds, while the books present a more nuanced internal struggle between the seductive emptiness of compliance and the exhausting work of maintaining selfhood. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? And I wonder whether the Imperious Curse resonates differently across cultures with varying historical relationships to authoritarianism. Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled, because the global reach of Harry Potter fandom suggests these themes of control, resistance, and the value of free will speak to something universal in human experience. You breathe slowly and recognize that these two curses together represent the poles of human fear. We fear pain, and we fear losing ourselves, and the wizarding world's decision to place both violations in the same legal category as murder suggests a moral framework that values both bodily integrity and psychological autonomy as prerequisites for human dignity, which is actually quite sophisticated ethical thinking for a fictional society that also believes prophecies are real and allows children to play sports on flying broomsticks hundreds of feet above the ground. You turn now toward a different category of dark magic, the spells invented or refined by Severus Snape during his years as the Half-Blood Prince, that troubled young wizard whose textbook marginalia would one day nearly kill Draco Malfoy in a bathroom, and whose creative magical mind produced innovations that blur every comfortable line between defensive ingenuity and aggressive cruelty. And as you settle further into this exploration, you recognize that Snape's spells represent something the series rarely addresses directly. The ongoing development of new dark magic, the reality that the catalog of terrible spells was not fixed in ancient times, but continues expanding through the work of brilliant, troubled minds. Sectum Sempra stands as Snape's most notorious creation, a curse that slashes the target as if struck by an invisible sword, causing wounds that bleed profusely and resist ordinary magical healing, requiring specific counter-curses that Snape also invented but did not bother to share widely, which is rather like inventing a new disease and keeping the vaccine recipe in your personal notebook. Ethically questionable, though perhaps understandable given Snape's general approach to information sharing, which can best be described as paranoid hoarding with occasional dramatic revelations. The mainstream historical fact underlying Sectum Sempra's conception involves the very real medieval belief in cutting words, the idea that certain spoken formulas could cause physical injury at a distance, documented in numerous grimoires and magical treatises from the 14th through 17th centuries. The Munich Manual of Demonic Magic, a 15th century German text, includes instructions for curses meant to cause bleeding wounds, suggesting that Rowling drew upon genuine historical traditions of harmful word magic when constructing Snape's invention. Harry's use of Sectum Sempra against Draco in The Half-Blood Prince represents one of the series' most morally complex moments because Harry cast a spell without understanding its effects, essentially pulling the magical equivalent of firing an unlabeled weapon and discovering only afterward that it was loaded with something terrible. And the horror on his face as Draco bleeds across the bathroom floor forces both character and reader to confront the consequences of careless violence. Honestly, if magical schools had any sense, don't cast spells you found written in mysterious used textbooks would be day one curriculum. But Hogwarts seems to operate on the educational philosophy that traumatic learning experiences build character. The quirky historical tidbit relevant here involves the peculiar career of Elias Ashmole, the 17th-century English antiquary who collected magical manuscripts while simultaneously serving as a founding member of the Royal Society, and his personal papers include notes on blood-drawing charms that he believed genuinely functional, representing the transitional period when educated Europeans had not yet fully distinguished between science and magic. And one imagines Snape would have appreciated Ashmole's approach to knowledge collection, which involved acquiring everything dangerous and interesting without particular concern for safety regulations. You observe that Snape's other inventions mentioned in the series include Levicorpus, the spell that hoists victims into the air by their ankles, which Snape intended as a dueling tool, but which the Marauders apparently stole and used for bullying purposes, creating the uncomfortable reality that Snape's innovative magic was turned against him by his tormentors. And there is scholarly debate about whether this narrative detail is meant to generate sympathy for young Snape or simply demonstrate the irony that violence often returns to its creator in unexpected forms. Muffliato, another Snape creation, fills listeners' ears with buzzing that prevents eavesdropping, a spell that seems relatively benign until you consider the privacy violations it enables. And Langlock, which glues the target's tongue to the roof of their mouth, carries obvious bullying applications that a teenage Snape probably enjoyed imagining, even if he lacked the social position to deploy it. There is something deeply sad about a lonely boy sitting in his dormitory, inventing new ways to silence people, and scholars of children's literature have noted that Snape's spell creation represents displaced aggression, the impulse toward violence channeled into intellectual pursuits that maintain the violence while adding a layer of creative distance. The question of when defensive magic becomes dark magic runs throughout examination of Snape's work. Sectum Sempra could theoretically protect against attackers, Levicorpus could theoretically restrain dangerous individuals, and Muffliato could theoretically protect sensitive conversations, but the aggressive applications seem more natural, more aligned with the spell's inherent violence, and this ambiguity reflects what some scholars call an open question in the text, regarding whether magic itself carries moral weight or whether only the intention of the caster matters. You breathe slowly and recognize that Snape's legacy as a spell creator parallels his legacy as a person, brilliant, damaged, capable of both cruelty and protection, and ultimately difficult to categorize within comfortable moral frameworks, rather like trying to file a platypus in a taxonomy designed for normal animals. Except the platypus in question also made terrible life choices involving unrequited love and nose-based insults. The films largely downplayed Snape's role as an innovator, focusing instead on his relationship with Lily Potter and his complex position as a double agent. But the books present a young man whose magical creativity emerged directly from his suffering, suggesting that dark magic and emotional pain share intimate connections that neither Hogwarts nor the Ministry ever adequately addressed. Mental health services in the wizarding world remain, shall we say, underdeveloped, given that the primary response to student trauma seems to be, have some chocolate and watch out for dementors. You find yourself contemplating whether Snape's spells should be considered dark at all, given that classification seems to depend more on political context than inherent magical properties, and this uncertainty extends to how we remember Snape himself. Is he a villain who occasionally did good things, or a hero whose methods included unforgivable cruelty? And the answer probably depends on which moment in his life you examine, which is either profound commentary on human complexity or frustrating authorial ambivalence, depending on your tolerance for moral ambiguity in children's literature. You drift deeper now into exploration of the dark spells that served Voldemort's regime directly, the magical instruments of terror that the Death Eaters wielded not merely to harm individuals, but to control populations through fear. And chief among these stands Mors Mordre, the incantation that conjures the dark mark into the sky, that gleaming green skull with a serpent tongue that became the signature of Voldemort's followers, and the symbol that made entire communities flee in panic. And as you settle into contemplation of this magic, you recognize that Mors Mordre functions less as a weapon than as a message, a declaration that death has visited this place and more death will follow. The mechanics of the Dark Mark spell involve conjuring a massive luminous image that hangs in the sky above the caster's location, visible for miles. and the psychological effect of this image proves far more significant than any physical harm the spell itself causes. Death Eaters cast Mors Mortar after attacks specifically to claim credit, to ensure that survivors and witnesses understood exactly who had visited violence upon them, which represents a sophisticated understanding of terrorism as communication that would feel familiar to any historian studying the tactics of fear throughout human civilization. The mainstream historical fact relevant here involves the very real practice of heraldic display following medieval battles, where victorious armies would raise banners and standards to claim territory and demoralize surviving opposition. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 included Harold's famous standard with the fighting man, and its capture by Norman forces symbolized English defeat as much as Harold's death did, suggesting that magical branding of attack sites represents an evolution of ancient military psychology rather than pure invention. You observe that Fiendfire, another dark spell deployed during the series, operates through entirely different principles. It conjures cursed flames that take the shape of monstrous creatures, burns with such intensity that it can destroy Horcruxes, and, here's the uncomfortable detail, proves nearly impossible to control, meaning that casting Fiendfire is essentially releasing a fire monster and hoping it attacks your enemies before it consumes you, rather like training a bear to do your bidding, except the bear is made of flames and hates everyone equally. Vincent Crabbe's death in the Room of Requirement, consumed by the very Fiendfire he conjured, serves as both narrative justice and practical demonstration of why certain magic should remain forbidden regardless of how useful it might seem in the moment, and there is something almost Greek tragedy about a character dying from his own weapon, as if Rowling wanted to remind readers that dark magic extracts costs from its practitioners as well as its victims, though honestly, Crabbe had so little characterization throughout 7 books that his death functions more as plot device than tragic conclusion, which represents either economical storytelling or underdeveloped secondary characters depending on your critical perspective. The quirky historical tidbit connected to Fiendfire involves the medieval European belief in wildfire, a substance that could not be extinguished by water and was associated with demonic intervention. Greek fire, the actual Byzantine incendiary weapon, contributed to these legends, and 12th century chronicles describe attacking forces who believed they faced supernatural flames when Byzantine ships deployed their secret weapon, creating a historical precedent for magical fire that operated outside normal physical laws. You recognize that other dark spells in the series served more utilitarian purposes for Voldemort's regime. The taboo placed on his name during the Second Wizarding War broke protective enchantments and revealed the location of anyone who spoke Voldemort aloud, essentially weaponizing the fearful habit of saying, "you know who," that the wizarding population had developed. And there is bitter irony in the detail that those brave enough to speak the Dark Lord's name were punished for their courage, while those too frightened to name him remained marginally safer. A system that rewarded cowardice and punished defiance, exactly the psychological conditioning that authoritarian regimes throughout real history have employed. The caterwauling charm, which produces screaming alarms when unauthorized individuals enter protected areas, might seem merely a security measure until you consider that the Death Eaters used it to trap residents of Hogsmeade in their own homes, transforming a village into a prison without visible bars. And scholars of dystopian literature have noted that Rowling's depiction of occupied wizarding Britain during Deathly Hallows draws heavily on historical accounts of Nazi-occupied Europe, where residents similarly found themselves confined, surveilled, and subject to arbitrary violence. You breathe slowly and contemplate the Confundus charm in its darker applications, which when cast with sufficient power can leave victims permanently disoriented, and the Obliviate charm, which erases memories and was used systematically by the Ministry even before Voldemort's takeover, raising uncomfortable questions about how frequently light institutions employed dark methods. The open scholarly debate here concerns whether Rowling intended to critique governmental overreach or simply needed plot-convenient memory erasure, and the answer probably involves both purposes serving different narrative needs at different moments. The Entrail Expelling Curse, mentioned briefly as a spell that does exactly what its name suggests, represents the more grotesque end of dark magic. and one imagines that defense against the dark arts classes probably skipped detailed discussion of that particular horror, focusing instead on curses that students might actually encounter rather than obscure disembowelment magic that sounds more like medieval torture than practical combat. Though perhaps Hogwarts curriculum advisors simply wanted to avoid the inevitable student complaints that would follow from describing intestinal removal in morning classes, you find yourself recognizing that dark spells in the Harry Potter universe form a spectrum rather than a single category. Some dark magic kills instantly, some tortures endlessly, some controls completely, some burns uncontrollably, and some simply claims territory through fear, and this variety suggests that dark magic is less a coherent magical tradition than a political label applied to spells that authorities deem too dangerous for ordinary use, which raises the question of who gets to make such determinations and whether those determinations serve public safety or merely consolidate power. A question that the series raises without fully answering, perhaps because the answer is too uncomfortable for children's literature, or perhaps because Rowling recognized that some questions deserve contemplation rather than resolution. You settle now into the final passage of this journey through the dark spells of the wizarding world, and as the examination of specific curses and hexes fades gently into broader reflection, you find your thoughts turning toward the nature of dark magic itself, toward the philosophical questions that underlie any categorization of certain powers as forbidden, and toward the comfort that understanding fictional darkness can provide when the real world contains shadows enough. The 18 dark spells we have explored tonight, from the 3 Unforgivables through Snape's marginal inventions, through the regime-serving terrors of Moore's Mortar and Fiendfire, share a common thread that extends beyond their individual mechanisms. Each represents a choice, a decision to employ power in service of domination, cruelty or fear rather than protection, healing or connection. And this choice forms the moral core of Rowling's magical system, the insistence that magic itself is neutral, but the heart behind the wand determines everything. The mainstream historical fact that closes our examination involves the genuine debate among Renaissance magical theorists about whether certain kinds of knowledge were inherently corrupting. Marsilio Ficino, the 15th century Florentine philosopher who translated Plato and the Hermetic texts, argued that studying demonic magic, even to understand and combat it, risked damaging the student's soul, while his contemporary Pico della Mirandola maintained that knowledge itself was always good and only application could be evil, a disagreement that mapped exactly onto later debates within the Harry Potter fandom about whether studying dark magic in school prepared students to resist darkness or simply taught them how to be darker. You observe that the quirky historical tidbit underlying this reflection involves the peculiar career of Johannes Trithemius, a German abbot who wrote extensively about cryptography and angel magic in the late 1400s, and whose book Steganographia appeared to be a guide to communicating with spirits, but was later discovered to be an elaborate encryption system disguised as occult knowledge, meaning that one of history's most famous dark magic texts was actually a mathematics textbook in costume, rather like discovering that your terrifying spell book is actually a very dramatic cookbook. The scholarly debate that remains open in Harry Potter studies concerns whether the series ultimately endorses an essentialist or constructivist view of good and evil. Does dark magic corrupt users because of something inherent in its nature? Or do we call certain magic dark because of how corrupted users choose to employ it? And this question matters because it determines whether redemption is always possible or whether certain choices close certain doors forever. Harry using Crucio suggests that good people can employ dark magic without becoming dark themselves, while the physical deterioration of Voldemort's face suggests that dark magic leaves visible marks on those who embrace it fully. You find yourself breathing more slowly now, recognizing that the hour has grown late and the cataloging of fictional cruelties has served its purpose. Not to celebrate darkness, but to understand it. Not to fear fictional horrors, but to recognize that even the most terrible magic in Rowling's world operates according to rules that can be learned and, more importantly, resisted. And there is deep comfort in rules, in the knowledge that even chaos has structure, even evil has limits. Even the killing curse could not overcome a mother's love. The warmth of wherever you rest tonight presses gently against you, and the weight of dark spells and terrible curses begins to lift from your thoughts like morning mist rising from still water, because stories about darkness exist precisely so that we can contain darkness within safe boundaries, can examine it and name it, and ultimately set it aside when the story ends. You notice the way your body has relaxed during this journey, the way tension has slowly released from muscles you did not realize you were holding tight, and you recognize that understanding fictional evil provides a peculiar form of peace, the reassurance that comes from knowing the monsters and their mechanisms, from mapping the territory of imagined fear until it becomes familiar rather than frightening. The spells we discuss tonight will remain in their fictional world, confined to pages and screens and the imaginations of readers who have traveled through these stories alongside millions of others across decades and continents. And you are part of that vast community now, carrying this knowledge gently as you drift toward sleep. The fire has burned low in the imaginary hearth, and the drawer of terrible spells has been examined and closed again, returned to its place in the department of mysteries where it will wait for the next curious mind. You breathe deeply, slowly, feeling the weight of your blankets or the support of your pillow, and you release the dark magic back into fiction where it belongs, carrying with you only the understanding that stories help us process what we fear, that naming terrors diminishes them, that every spell in Harry Potter, no matter how dark, exists within a narrative where love ultimately triumphs over cruelty, where the choice to protect matters more than the power to destroy. The gentle darkness of ordinary night surrounds you now, soft and safe and full of approaching dreams, and you let yourself drift toward sleep, knowing that the real magic of bedtime stories lies not in their content, but in their containment, their ability to hold difficult truths within frames we control. Your eyes grow heavy, your thoughts begin to blur pleasantly at the edges, and the last image that lingers is not of green light or cursed fire, but of quiet, of rest, of the peace that comes when the story has been told and the listener can finally let go. Sleep well.